This is House Planning Help, episode 24. Hi, I'm Ben Adam Smith, and this is the podcast for you if you're thinking about building or retrofitting a property. We're exploring what houses we should be building in the 21st century. My personal goal is to create an energy-efficient home before I turn 40 in August 2016. Coming up today, we're looking into eco-minimalism, and I'm particularly excited about this one for a couple of reasons. First of all, it's a topic that seems to make sense, and I like those. And secondly, we have a guest who I find very inspiring, and I've been trying to get him onto the podcast for a while. So we'll be getting into the interview with Jonathan Hines from Archetype very soon. First though, I wanted to let you know that I'm working on our next Google Plus Hangout. This is a forum for discussion, and we've done it once before. Our first debate was on finding the balance between heritage and sustainable design. So if you missed that one, you can go back and see what it's like, houseplanninghelp.com/16 for that episode. But in our second debate, I want to look into housing density. And it's particularly relevant to me at the moment because there's an area of scrubland about half a mile away from where I live that's getting redeveloped. And I would love to see it become a very green place, low density housing on a scale that I feel is in keeping with our town. But then I suppose you have to temper that a bit with these houses have got to go somewhere. We've got targets that the government are setting. They want more houses. So that could mean if we go low density in our town that it will eventually sprawl onto greenfield sites. So is that a good idea? The UK is fairly compact compared to other countries like France. And then you've got to think about higher density housing in a town. Is it more sustainable? And there are all sorts of arguments, but it's very interesting. So I'm looking to put together a panel. If you're on Google+, let me know if you'd like to get involved, particularly if you're someone who has strong opinions one way or the other. I'll put a link in today's show notes. It's houseplanninghelp.com/24. Let's move on to our interview for this session. Jonathan Hines is my guest, and he's one of the directors at Archetype. They have a great reputation in the industry for sustainable architecture, and I'm particularly interested in the principles that guide them as a business. This podcast is very much focused on houses, so we stick to that. But I'd really encourage you to go and look into Archetype's work on schools, and they've also won a design competition for the University of East Anglia, and they've been going a long time, so they've got all sorts of other projects that you can investigate. Their website link is in our show notes too, as is that of Arche House. Arche House is a separate company that Jonathan has formed with Lars Carlson, and we'll learn more about its aims in this interview as we focus on their proposed housing scheme for Kingstone. They've submitted a planning application to build 150 houses and in the process establish a local house factory. I was at the Passive House conference last year and Jonathan gave a presentation on this scheme, and I have to say it was fascinating. He's a great speaker anyway, but some of the information, there were all sorts of questions, and one person at the end said simply, "You've just created my dream project." So of course, that's why I want to find out some more. In today's interview, I started by asking Jonathan about what makes Archetype different.
Well, I guess our approach has always been to try and keep buildings simpler in order to make better spaces and better standards of insulation and energy efficiency, sustainability. So whereas I think many architects like to they like complexity, they like adding things, engineers like technology, we try and make the building simple. And that doesn't mean boring, it means, we always say, elegantly simple, something that simplifies things down to what works best and uses the building to do all the hard work in terms of being at one with the environment.
So on a practical scale, how do you get started on that? It seems like a big mission, really, because sometimes it is easier to complicate things.
Yeah, I once heard a story from a civil servant who was sending a report to the minister, and he said, "I'm sorry it's so long, but I haven't had time to finish it yet." To actually make something simple takes longer. But it's something we've always been fascinated by from our earliest roots doing Siegel self-build. Walter Siegel had already designed a system of construction. It was all about paring down construction to the basic elements and keeping it simple in order that people could self-build it themselves. So our roots really have always been in understanding simple detailing, keeping the form of the building functional but also beautiful. So it's always been how we tick. But I think in a world which seems to like complexity, it's always been quite hard work to plough that furrow, I guess, and really focus on the simplicity. And it does take a constant reminder. We have it as one of our sort of core guiding principles, along with being radically sustainable, to actually be elegantly simple. So when we're reviewing our work, we're always saying, is this simple enough? Could we make this work better? What can we take out to make it work better?
What demands do we have for the buildings that we live in these days?
Demands, I guess, have been increasing gradually. People have a higher aspiration for comfort than they maybe did 50 years ago, and there's higher regulatory requirements on efficiency, and there's more awareness about the wider sustainability of materials. So I think on many levels, year by year, there's more awareness about the importance of doing things to a higher standard, but achieving that, I think, is the big challenge. How do you do that?
And Passive House, I noticed that you are very much into that. Are all your buildings Passive House now?
Not all of them, but more than half of our current work is being designed to Passive House, which is a lot when you think how much there is in the UK. We've been one of the pioneers of Passive House, as a few other architects, and now it's taking off quite a big way. But we adopted Passive House because for us it seemed to offer a logical framework to actually do what we were tending to do anyway, but a rigorous analysis, discipline, and a quality assurance process in terms of design and construction, rather than just basing it on our intuitive assumptions, which we guiding us in that direction, actually to give us the rigour of a tool that actually helps us to achieve things.
And are certain buildings lending themselves more to that than others, or can it be anything in your portfolio? Because I know that you have a strong basis on schools, for example.
Passive house can be applied to any type of building, and people sometimes get confused by the word house. I think it's just domestic. In the English translation it is, in the German it actually means building, and it applies to any type of building. So we've done a number of schools, as you say. We've done 3 finished and certified passive schools. We've got a 4th school, currently passive house school on site at the moment. We're also doing a major research building for the University of East Anglia. We've just got planning permission for a church to Passive House in Sheffield. We're currently designing an archive and records office in Herefordshire to Passive House, and we're doing quite a few individual houses in a major housing development of 150 houses. In Germany, people are doing fire stations, hotels, hospitals, anything really.
Thinking about the project that you've got on creating a development, where did you start on that, at this almost affordable housing? Because that's the other thing about Passive House, that people sometimes say, it costs a bit more, and you have a different view on that.
Yeah, I guess our view on that has been framed by the history of all the buildings that we've done have always been, and this is long before we're doing Passive House, the high levels of sustainability we've achieved have always been within tight and standard budgets. So, for example, we did the first BREEAM Excellent primary school in the UK for Wolverhampton City Council with no extra budget, again by keeping it simple and focusing on that. And when we suggested to the same client that we should do Passive House, they said, we like that idea, but you've got no more money. So we had to do it for the same price. And we did that by building it in from first principles, by keeping the form of the building simple, the section simple, the detailing simple, the window arrangement simple. But again, if you've seen them, hopefully you would agree they're not boring. When it comes to the housing development that you just mentioned, I think housing is a much bigger challenge because costs are much lower already. Housing developers build to a very, very low price, as you're aware, but also to a low standard, I think, on the whole. And when we've talked to developers, with the exception of 1 or 2 smaller scale developers who we've done some interesting work with, most bigger housing developers aren't particularly interested in improving design quality nor sustainability because they can sell what they produce, because there's little choice in the market. So we decided to go it alone and do our own development. So we founded a new company in partnership with a retired Swedish businessman who'd approached us because he had seen, when he moved to England, in his opinion, how backward UK construction is. He just said, well, in Sweden we build houses in factories. Why on earth do you build them brick by brick on site? And so the whole idea of ArchiHouse is, from first principles, to come up with a way of designing houses that are optimised from first principle to Passive House, to lay out the site so it's optimised from first principles to achieve Passive House, and then to prefabricate those houses in a new house factory that we plan to establish to do that. And so basically at every level we're working very hard with a big focus on improving quality and achieving Passive House.
Again, is that something that's perhaps in our minds a little bit, that having it in a factory is not a good idea? Is it just something that perhaps we've got to get used to?
Yeah, I think most buildings are largely built on site in the UK, But in Germany and Sweden, it's a well-established industry that houses are built, both developments and a lot of one-off houses, in factories. And that means to an amazing level of quality. And I visited a number of Swedish factories and was this week actually visiting factories in Germany. The attention to detail and the quality of construction is way, way in advance of anything I've seen in the UK. So I think prefabrication in the UK psyche harks back to the sort of prefabs that put out after the war as a quick solution. And what we're talking about in terms of modern house factory production is something of a different order of quality than anything I've seen in the UK.
Maybe you could talk us through the housing development that you've got there. We're lucky enough that we're in a room that we've got these pictures on the wall, which is detailing it. Has it all got the go-ahead now?
We submitted it for planning application. We don't expect it to get through the process of that for about 3 months. That's the time it takes. It went in last month. It'll take about 3 months to go through. I mean, we are based in rural Herefordshire, where there's a big housing need, but a big challenge in finding appropriate sites to build enough houses. People generally don't like new houses being built in their village, and I totally understand why that might be. I think it's often the case that people are against it because what's on offer is high density, suburban, poor quality and not appropriate to a rural site. And so what we set out to do was to see if we couldn't come up with a new approach that would not only be passive house, but also would be of higher quality in terms of its design of buildings and landscape, in particular to be appropriate to its rural setting. So we started off by doing a study of typical Herefordshire vernacular architecture and the character of the Herefordshire landscape, and set out to reinterpret that in a modern contemporary way. So instead of a suburban character site, which most developers do with wide roads, curbs, pavements, fences, parking spaces, etc., it just has a whole suburban feel to it. We've designed a layout which is of lower density with winding lanes, winding through a sort of landscape with hedgerows and swales and ditches and orchards. So it's very much reflecting the character of the Herefordshire landscape. It'll feel completely different to a normal housing development because of that. And it's got generous areas of shared open space, allotments, areas for food growing, etc. And then the houses themselves, what we discovered, which is quite interesting, is that the typical vernacular building in Herefordshire, like the one we're sitting in here, tends to be shallow in depth, wide in frontage with a roof running along the length. Most developer houses tend to be narrow in width, deep in plan, which means that you get far less daylight and sunlight into the depth of the house, whereas on the traditional vernacular houses, they tended to be wider and got more light into them. And when you do a passive house analysis, you're better off with a slightly wider house that gets more solar gain and better daylight. So actually the traditional vernacular form and the passive house optimised shape actually have a very strong synergy together, which I also think in retrospect is not that surprising because old vernacular houses were built to maximise their relationship to the environment. You know, they had small windows for cost and buildability, but they wanted to get as much daylight in as possible. So we were able to reflect that, but reinterpret that in a modern way and come up with something which we think is of a scale and form and material character that's appropriate but modern, set in a rural landscape which is more appropriate.
I noticed just towards the end there you said the word modern. Is that something, again, that we struggle with a bit in the UK, particularly when we have this vernacular, which can seem very nice, but I know, having grown up in a village, that you almost see the new modern thing and get scared by it a bit, or it feels like it doesn't fit in. So this is very much something that's going to form part of this village and feel alive.
Yeah, I think it'll fit in because it's of a form and scale that's appropriate, but in terms of its internal character, it has the ability to be quite open plan. If people want to, they can obviously have separate rooms, but it's designed because it's shallower and wider, it can be more open plan more flexibly. And in terms of the windows and the detailing, it'll have a crisp modern feel to it. I don't think people are put off by that. I think there's quite whenever we have clients to actually work with, as opposed to your perception that comes through the house builders, where we work with self-builders, they like light airy spaces, slightly higher ceilings, more open plan feel, modern materials, modern detailing. And I think programmes like Grand Designs, people have actually, I think awareness has changed of design quality. And I just don't think the housing developers have caught up with that yet.
Is there a situation where they are going to be caught out? Because you can't make these changes overnight. And I do think you're right that people are coming to demand different things of their housing. And with the internet and with shows like Grand Designs, you can see what you could have now. And it seems silly mimicking these styles from the past that aren't even really done that well anyway.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think there's some quite good examples of modern housing in urban situations, which is much more contemporary, and all the evidence is they've sold and people like them. I think it's more in the sort of mass housing market in suburban and rural areas where the design quality issue has not really hit yet. But interestingly, earlier or last year, the RIBA Future Homes Commission actually reported some very interesting findings that people liked the idea of a modern house, but they tended not to buy them because what they saw in them was of poor architectural quality. So the things they like in a house are light, airy spaces, higher ceilings, good-sized windows. Now they see those in a Georgian or Victorian house, and they don't see those in the new houses that they look at. So they'll buy an old house, albeit it's cold and drafty and it's going to cost a fortune to heat, because the architectural qualities there overweigh those sort of practical things. So my belief is that if we can combine the practical things of energy efficiency and lower running costs with good architectural quality, then we are onto a winner. Now, although for us 150 houses is a quite ambitious thing, it's a pinprick in terms of the housing development across the country. I'd love to believe that in the long term we can actually have an influence on changing the industry, but we'll see.
I think you're certainly taking a big step in that direction, so I'm very excited to see how it goes on. Are you always with an eye on the future? Because to me, this development is quite futuristic, but are you always thinking, what is the next step?
Yeah, I guess we are. I think throughout our nearly now 30 years of practice, we've always been exploring new ways of doing things, not particularly for the sake of being innovative for the sake of it, but because we're always striving to try and find more sustainable ways of building and constructing, ways to save energy, different materials that can be used to create more beautiful buildings. And I think we've just been driven by that, and people have come to work for us because they're personally committed to sustainability and design quality and actually believe in the ability of design to do that. So I guess it's been a restless quest and will continue. And I think in different ways we've always pushed the boundaries and in some ways led the industry. 20 years ago we were sort of slightly laughed at being on the sort of hairy eco-fringe, doing slightly strange things. Now I think we've gained a degree of respect for the way we've pioneered and led the industry, and I hope we can keep doing that.
And some of these materials that you're talking about, what would you say are the most sustainable of them? Is it just going back to things like wood?
Yeah, I mean, we've tried out lots of different materials over the years and obviously found some work really well, others have been more difficult, and others are appropriate to certain situations. So we have used straw bale, we have used earth construction, which in some places are beautiful things to do, in other places for mass housing or for schools would be much harder and maybe less appropriate. I guess we've honed in on a fairly robust palette of what we are confident are renewable and sustainable materials. So yes, we do use a lot of timber. We do use quite a bit of homegrown timber. We use insulation made from recycled newspaper. We've got a range of mineral and organic paints and stains that we regularly use. Floor finishes in liner and rubber, certain window specs for triple glazing and different performances. So a whole set of materials and products that we've tried and tested, and we know where they come from and we're confident in their sustainability.
Do you try to avoid other technologies? I know the simplicity of form is great, but I don't see any solar panels on the roofs here. Are you still under the impression that there will be infrastructure? It's about sorting out the houses to the best that they can be.
Yeah, I think my belief is that buildings, well designed, are really good instruments of saving energy. I don't think they're particularly good generators of energy. They can be, if you've got a large south-facing roof, then maybe photovoltaics can be a good option. But many buildings, and you see them all over the country now with PVs perched in funny places, sitting behind chimneys, facing east-west and sometimes even north, because people have managed to get a grant or got a feed-in tariff and they'll get some return on it. But if the imperative is to save carbon across the whole world now, then every panel we put up should be in the most optimum position we can find to put it. And I think in most cases, perched on roofs is not that great. For a start, they generally won't get cleaned. So my belief is that we should be focusing on buildings designed to save energy and then looking at the most appropriate and efficient scales and places to generate renewable energy. So I would much prefer to see solar arrays on the ground in fields where you can clean them and maintain them, and they're big enough to be properly looked after, so that you haven't got a separate inverter in 5,000 houses that when it goes wrong, the wholesaler is probably not going to sort out, as opposed to a properly run at a community scale or even a regional scale. And big wind turbines in the North Sea, not little ones perched on top of buildings which don't go around. So I always say I compare energy to rubbish. I always say it's good to recycle rubbish, it's much better not to create it in the first place. So with energy, it's good to have renewable energy, but let's first use less of it. And then let's find the best scale and the right place to generate it renewably.
Well, thank you very much for this interview. It's been very interesting, and I certainly know that you guys are the ones to keep our eyes on. Jonathan, thank you.
Thank you very much. It's been very enjoyable.
Find out more about Archetype and Archihouse by checking out our show notes for this episode, houseplanninghelp.com/24. We've got pictures of some of their previous projects and also the designs of the new scheme that we've been talking about. But I also want to ask you, what do you think about eco-minimalism? You can leave a comment at the bottom of the show notes. Does it resonate with you and your picture of how the future's going to look? I certainly find it very interesting, and I would love to hear your thoughts. So we're just about complete. There is one bit of good news, or my personal good news, that I'd like to share with you this week, that my production company, Regen Media, has been commissioned to make a series of 13 podcasts on town regeneration. And I thought that this is something, because there is a slight overlap here. I'm very community centred, and I love the fact that we're involved with this, because over the last few years the hearts of our towns, they've been changing. Perhaps you've noticed it. Maybe shops have become vacant, or the offering has changed from butchers and bakers to restaurants and hair salons. But internet shopping has had an effect, hasn't it? And also supermarkets, and as they have expanded, perhaps even the economy is changing our town centres. So what exactly do we do? How do we move forward? Are there any lessons to learn? It's what we'll be doing in this podcast series. So I'm very excited about that project. It's still a few months away, but I wanted to share that news with you first. My one call to action for this episode as we come towards the end is for you to sign up to our email newsletter. 3 reasons why you might want to do this. Firstly, we share really helpful information that is just reserved for our email subscribers. Secondly, we'll let you know as soon as a new podcast is released so you can come and check it out. And we'll also tell you ahead of time which guests we've got lined up. So go to houseplanninghelp.com/subscribe if you'd like to sign up to that, and that would be great. We want to keep you in touch. Next time, we're staying with Archetype, actually. We're doing the double, and I'll be speaking to Elron Burrell as we look at some of the myths of Passive House. Things like, can you open the windows in a Passive House? Let's mull that for a moment. So we'll find out in the next session. I hope you can join me then. Thanks for listening.